very well. You understand that? Good. Then a further proof. Tomorrow, Mademoiselle will tell us what happened to her tonight, how she came to go to the house of Madame Levay. Everything. I wish you to be present. You shall know everything. I shall tell you myself, step by step, how my conclusions were reached. All your questions shall be answered. I shall give you every help, every opportunity. I shall see to it that you are not even called as a witness of what you have seen tonight. And when all is over, monsieur, you will see with me that whatever there may be of pain and distress, the law must take its course. It was a new Hanaud whom Frobisher was contemplating now. The tricks, the gasconades, the buffooneries had gone. He did not even triumph. A dignity shone out of the man like a strong light, and with it he was gentle and considerate. "Good night, monsieur," he said, and bowed, and Jim, on an impulse, thrust out his hand. "Good night," he returned. Hanaud took it with a smile of recognition and went away. Jim Frobisher locked the front door, and with a sense of desolation turned back to the hall. He heard the big iron gates swing to. They had been left open, of course, he recognized, in the usual way when one of the household was going to be late. Yes, everything had been planned with the care of a commander planning a battle. Here in this house the servants were all tucked up in their beds. But for Hanaud, Betty Harlowe might at this very moment have been stealing up these stairs noiselessly to her own room, a dreadful work accomplished. The servants would have waked tomorrow to the knowledge that Anne Upcott had fled rather than face a trial. Sometime in the evening Espinosa would have called, would have been received in the treasure-room, would have found the spade waiting for him in the great stone-vaulted kitchen of the Hôtel de Brébizard. Oh, yes, all dangers had been foreseen, except Hanaud. Nay, even he, in a measure, had been foreseen, for a panic-stricken telegram had reached Frobisher and Hazlitt before Hanaud had started upon his work. "I shall be on the stairs, monsieur, below mademoiselle's door, if you should want me," said Moreau. Jim Frobisher roused himself from his reflections. "Thank you," he answered, and he went up the stairs to his room. A lot of use to Betty that telegram had been, he reflected bitterly. Where was she tonight? He asked, and shut up his mind against the question. He was to know that it was precisely that panic-stricken telegram and nothing else which had brought Betty Harlowe's plans crashing about her ears. Chapter 24. Anne Upcott's Story. Early the next morning, Hanaud rang up the Maison Renelle and made his appointment for the afternoon. Jim accordingly spent the morning with Monsieur Bex, who was quite overwhelmed with the story which was told to him. "Prisoners have their rights nowadays," he said. "They can claim the presence of their legal adviser when they are being examined by the judge. I will go round at once to the prefecture." With his head erect and his little chest puffed out like a bantam cock, he hurried to do battle for his client. There was no battle to be waged, however. Certainly Monsieur Bex's unhappy client was for the moment au secret. She would not come before the judge for a couple of days. It was the turn of Francine Rollard. Every opportunity was to be given to the defence, and Monsieur Bex would certainly be granted an interview with Betty Harlowe, if she so wished, before she was brought up in the judge's office. Monsieur Bex returned to the Place Etienne Dolet to find Jim Frobisher restlessly pacing his office. Jim looked up eagerly, but Monsieur Bex had no words of comfort. "I don't like it," he cried. "It displeases me. I'm not happy. They're all very polite, yes, but they examine the maid first. That's bad, I tell you." And he tapped upon the table. "That is Hanaud. He knows his affair. The servants, they can be made to talk, and this Francine Rollin—" He shook his head. "I shall get the best advocate in France." Jim left him to his work and returned to the Maison Grenelle. It was obvious that nothing of these new and terrible developments of the affaire Wabursky had yet leaked out. There was not a whisper of it in the streets, not a loiterer about the gates of the Maison Grenelle. The affaire Wabursky had, in the general view, become a stale joke. Jim sent up word to Anne Upcott in her room that he was removing his luggage to the hotel in the Place d'Arcy and leaving the house to her, where he prayed her to remain. Even at that moment Anne's lips twitched a little with humour as she read the embarrassed note. "He is very correct, as Monsieur Bex would say," she reflected, "and proper enough to make every nerve of Monsieur Hanaud thrill with delight." Jim returned in the afternoon, and once more in the shade of the sycamores, whilst the sunlight dappled the lawn and the bees hummed amongst the roses, Anne Upcott told a story of terror and darkness, though to a smaller audience. Certain additions were made to the story by Hanaud. "I should never have dreamed of going to Madame Lavey's ball," she began, "except for the anonymous letter," and Hanaud leaned forward alertly. The anonymous letter had arrived whilst she, Betty, and Jim Frobisher were sitting at dinner. It had been posted, therefore, in the middle of the day, and very soon after Anne had told her first story in the garden. Anne opened the envelope expecting a bill, and was amazed and a little terrified to read the signature, "The Scourge." She was more annoyed than ever when she read the contents, but her terror had decreased. The Scourge bade her attend the ball. He gave her explicit instructions that she should leave the ballroom at 10:30, follow a particular corridor leading to a wing away from the reception-rooms, and hide behind the curtains in a small library. If she kept very still, she would overhear in a little while the truth about the death of Mrs. Harlowe. She was warned to tell no one of her plan. "I told no one then," Anne declared. "I thought the letter just a malicious joke, quite in accord with the Scourge's character. I put it back into its envelope, but I couldn't forget it. Suppose that by any chance there was something in it, and I didn't go. Why should the Scourge play a trick on me, who had no money and was of no importance? And all the while the sort of hope which no amount of reasoning can crush kept growing and growing." After dinner Anne took the letter up to her sitting-room, and believed it, and scorned herself for believing it, and believed it again. That afternoon she had almost felt the handcuffs on her wrists. There was no chance which she ought to refuse of clearing herself from suspicion, however wild it seemed. Anne made up her mind to consult Betty, and ran down to the treasure-room, which was lit up but empty. It was 9:30. Anne determined to wait for Betty's return, and was once more perplexed by the low position of the clock upon the marquetry cabinet. She stood in front of it, staring at it. She took her own watch in her hand with a sort of vague idea that it might help her. And indeed it was very likely to. Had she turned its dial to the mirror behind the clock, the truth would have leapt at her. But she had not the time, for a slight movement in the room behind her arrested her attention. She turned abruptly. The room was empty, yet without doubt it was from within the room that the faint noise had come, and there was only one place from which it could have come. Someone was hiding within the elaborate sedan chair, with its shining grey panels, its delicate gold beading. Anne was uneasy rather than frightened. Her first thought was to ring the bell by the fireplace. She could do that well out of view of the sedan chair, and carry on until Gaston answered it. There were treasures enough in the room to repay 100 thieves. Then, without arguing at all, she took the bolder line. She went quietly towards the chair, advancing from the back, and then with a rush planted herself in front of the glass doors. She started back with a cry of surprise. The rail in front of the doors was down, the doors were open, and leaning back upon the billowy cushions sat Betty Harlow. She sat quite still, still as an image, even after Anne had appeared and uttered a cry of surprise. But she was not asleep. Her great eyes were blazing steadily out of the darkness of the chair in a way which gave Anne a curious shock. "I have been watching you," said Betty very slowly, and if ever there had been a chance that she would relent, that chance was gone for ever now. She had come up out of the secret passage to find Anne playing with her watch in front of the mirror, seeking for an explanation of the doubt which troubled her, and so near to it, so very near to it. Anne heard her own death sentence pronounced in those words, "I have been watching you," and though she did not understand the menace they conveyed, there was something in the slow, steady utterance of them which a little unnerved her. "Betty," she cried, "I want your advice." Betty came out of the chair and took the anonymous letter from her hand. "Ought I to go?" Anne Upcott asked. "It's your affair," Betty replied. "In your place I should. I shouldn't hesitate. No one knows yet that there's any suspicion upon you." Anne put forward her objection. To go from this house of mourning might appear an outrage. "You're not a relation," Betty argued. "You can go privately just before the time. I have no doubt we can arrange it all. But of course it's your affair." "Why should the scourge help me?" "I don't suppose that he is, except indirectly," Betty reasoned. "I imagine that he's attacking other people and using you." She read through the letter again. "He has always been right, hasn't he? That's what would determine me in your place. But I don't want to interfere." Anne spun round on her heel. "Very well, I shall go." "Then I should destroy that letter," and she made as if to tear it. "No," cried Anne, and she held out her hand for it. "I don't know Madame Leveille's house very well. I might easily lose my way without the instructions. I must take it with me." Betty agreed and handed the letter back. "You want to go quite quietly," she said, and she threw herself heart and soul into the necessary arrangements. She would give Francine Rollard a holiday, and herself help Anne to dress in her fanciful and glistening frock. She wrote a letter to Michel Leveille, Madame Leveille's second son, and one of Betty's most indefatigable courtiers. Fortunately for himself, Michel Leveille kept that letter, and it saved him from any charge of complicity in her plot. For Betty used to him the same argument which had persuaded Jim Frobisher. She wrote frankly that suspicion had centred upon Anne Upcott, and that it was necessary that she should get away secretly. "All the plans have been made, Michel," she wrote. "Anne will come late. She is to meet the friends who will help her. It is best that you should know as little as possible about them in the little library. If you will keep the corridor clear for a little while, they can get out by the library doors into the park and be in Paris the next morning." She sealed up this letter without showing it to Anne, and said, "I will send this by a messenger tomorrow morning with orders to deliver it into Michel's own hands. Now, how are you to go?" Over that point the two girls had some discussion. It would be inviting Hanaud's interference if the big limousine were ordered out. What more likely than that he should imagine Anne meant to run away, and that Betty was helping her? That plan certainly would not do. "I know," Betty cried. "Jean Leclerc shall call for you. You will be ready to slip out. She will stop her car for a second outside the gates. It will be quite dark. You'll be away in a flash." "Jean Leclerc?" Anne exclaimed, drawing back. It had always perplexed Anne that Betty, so exquisite and fastidious in her own looks and bearing, should have found her friends amongst the flamboyant and the cheap. But she would rather have thrown it amongst her inferiors than take her place amongst her equals. Under her reserved demeanour she was insatiable of recognition. The desire to be courted, admired, looked up to as a leader and a chief, burned within her like a raging flame. Jean Leclerc was of her company of satellites, a big, red-haired woman of excessive manners, not without good looks of a kind, and certainly received in the society of the town. Anne Upcott not merely disliked but distrusted her. She had a feeling that there was something indefinably wrong in her very nature. "She will do anything for me, Anne," said Betty. "That's why I named her. I know that she is going to Madame Lavey's dance." Anne Upcott gave in, and a second letter was written to Jean Leclerc. This second letter asked Jean to call at the Maison Grenelle at an early hour in the morning, and Jean Leclerc came and was closeted with Betty for an hour between 9 and 10. Thus all the arrangements were made. It was at this point that Frobisher interrupted Hanaud's explanations. "No," he said, "there remain Espinosa and the young brother to be accounted for."
"Mademoiselle has just told us that she heard a slight noise in the treasure-room and found Betty Hanaud seated in the sedan-chair," Hanaud replied. "Betty Hanaud had just returned from the Hôtel de Brébizat, whither Espinosa went that night after it had grown dark, and about the time when dinner was over in the Maison Grenelle. From the Hôtel de Brébizat, Espinosa went to the Rue Gambetta and waited for Jean Cladel. It was a busy night, that one, my friends. That old wolf, the law, was sniffing at the bottom of the door. They could hear him. They had no time to waste."
The next night came. Dinner was very late, Jim remembered. It was because Betty was helping Anne to dress, Francine having been given her holiday. Jim and Betty dined alone, and whilst they dined, Anne Upcott stole downstairs, a cloak of white ermine hiding her pretty dress. She held the front door a little open, and the moment Jean Leclerc's car stopped before the gates, she flashed across the courtyard. Jean had the door of her car open. It had hardly stopped before it went on again. Jim, as the story was told, remembered vividly Betty's preoccupation whilst dinner went on, and the immensity of her relief when the hall door so gently closed, and the car moved forward out of the street of Charles Robert. Anne Upcott had gone for good from the Maison Grenelle. She would not interfere with Betty Harlow any more. Jean Leclerc and Anne Upcott reached Madame Lavey's house a few minutes after 10. Michel Lavey came forward to meet them. "I'm so glad that you came, mademoiselle," he said to Anne. "But you are late. Madame, my mother, has left her place at the door of the ballroom, but we shall find her later." He took them to the cloakroom, and coming away they were joined by Espinosa. "You are going to dance now?" Michel Lavey asked. "No, not yet. Then Signor Espinosa will take you to the buffet while I look after others of our guests." He hurried away towards the ballroom, where a clatter of high voices competed with the music of the band. Espinosa conducted the two ladies to the buffet. There was hardly anybody in the room. "We are still too early," said Jean Leclerc in a low voice. "We shall take some coffee." But Anne would not. Her eyes were on the door, her feet danced, her hands could not keep still. Was the letter a trick? Would she indeed, within the next few minutes, learn the truth? At one moment her heart sank into her shoes, at another it soared. "Mademoiselle, you neglect your coffee," said Espinosa urgently, "and it is good." "No doubt," Anne replied. She turned to Jean Leclerc. "You will send me home, won't you? I shall not wait afterwards." "But of course," Jean Leclerc agreed. "All that is arranged. The chauffeur has his orders. You will take your coffee, dear?" Again Anne would not. "I want nothing," she declared. "It is time that I went."
She caught a swift and curious interchange of glances between Jean Leclerc and Espinosa, but she was in no mood to seek an interpretation. There could be no doubt that the coffee set before her had had some drug slipped into it by Espinosa when he fetched it from the buffet to the little table at which they sat, a drug which would have half stupefied her and made her easy to manage. But she was not to be persuaded, and she rose to her feet. "I shall get my cloak," she said, and she fetched it, leaving her two companions together. She did not return to the buffet. On the far side of the big central hall a long corridor stretched out. At the mouth of the corridor, guarding it, stood Michel Levet. He made a sign to her, and when she joined him, "Turn down to the right into the wing," he said in a low voice. "The small library is in front of you." Anne slipped past him. She turned into a wing of the house which was quite deserted and silent. At the end of it a shut door confronted her. She opened it softly. It was all dark within, but enough light entered from the corridor to show her the high bookcases ranged against the walls, the position of the furniture, and some dark, heavy curtains at the end. She was the first then to come to the tryst. She closed the door behind her and moved slowly and cautiously forwards with her hands outstretched until she felt the curtains yield. She passed in between them into the recess of a great bow window opening onto the park, and a sound, a strange creaking sound, brought her heart into her mouth. Someone was already in the room then. Somebody had been quietly watching as she came in from the lighted corridor. The sound grew louder. Anne peered between the curtains, holding them apart with shaking hands, and through that chink from behind her a vague twilight flowed into the room. In the far corner, near to the door, high up on a tall bookcase, something was clinging, something was climbing down. Whoever it was had been hiding behind the ornamental top of the heavy mahogany bookcase, was now using the shelves like the rungs of a ladder. Anne was seized with a panic. A sob broke from her throat. She ran for the door, but she was too late. A black figure dropped from the bookcase to the ground, and, as Anne reached out her hands to the door, a scarf was whipped about her mouth, stifling her cry. She was jerked back into the room, but her fingers had touched the light switch by the door, and as she stumbled and fell the room was lighted up. Her assailant fell upon her, driving the breath out of her lungs, and knotted the scarf tightly at the back of her head. Anne tried to lift herself, and recognized with a gasp of amazement that the assailant who pinned her down by the weight of her body and the thrust of her knees was Francine Rollard. A panic gave place to anger and a burning humiliation. She fought with all the strength of her supple body, but the scarf about her mouth stifled and weakened her, and with a growing dismay she understood that she was no match for the hardy peasant girl. She was the taller of the two, but her height did not avail her. She was like a child matched with a wildcat. Francine's hands were made of steel. She snatched Anne's arms behind her back and bound her wrists as she lay face downwards, her bosom labouring, her heart racing so that she felt that it must burst. Then, as Anne gave up the contest, she turned and tied her by the ankles. Francine was upon her feet again in a flash. She ran to the door, opened it a little way, and beckoned. Then she dragged her prisoner up onto a couch, and Jean Leclerc and Espinosa slipped into the room. "It's done," said Espinosa. Francine laughed. "Ah, but she fought, the pretty baby. You should have given her the coffee. Then she would have walked with us. Now she must be carried. She's wicked, I can tell you." Jean Leclerc twisted a lace scarf about the girl's face to hide the gag over her mouth, and, while Francine held her up, set her white cloak about her shoulders and fastened it in front. Espinosa then turned out the light and drew back the curtains. The room was at the back of the house, In the front of the window the park stretched away, but it was the park of a French chateau where the cattle feed up to the windows, and only a strip about the front terrace is devoted to pleasure gardens and fine lawns. Espinosa looked out upon meadow-land thickly studded with trees, and cows dimly moving in the dusk of the summer night like ghosts. He opened the window, and the throb of the music from the ballroom came faintly to their ears. "We must be quick," said Espinosa. He lifted the helpless girl in his arms and passed out into the park. They left the window open behind them, and between them they carried their prisoner across the grass, keeping where it was possible in the gloom of the trees, and aiming for a point in the drive where a motor-car waited half-way between the house and the gates. A blur of light from the terrace and ornamental grounds in front of it became visible away upon their left, but here all was dark. Once or twice they stopped and set Anne upon her feet, and held her so while they rested. "A few more yards," Espinosa whispered, and, stifling an oath, he stopped again. They were on the edge of the drive now, and just ahead of him he saw the glimmer of a white dress, and close to it the glow of a cigarette. Swiftly he put Anne down again and propped her against a tree. Jean Leclerc stood in front of her, and, as the truants from the ballroom approached, she began to talk to Anne, nodding her head like one engrossed in a lively story. Espinosa's heart stood still as he heard the man say, "Why, there are some others here. That is curious. Shall we see?" But even as he moved across the drive, the girl in the white dress caught him by the arm. "That would not be very tactful," she said with a laugh. "Let us do as we would be done by." And the couple sauntered past. Espinosa waited until they had disappeared. "Quick, let us go," he whispered in a shaking voice. A few yards farther on they found Espinosa's closed car hidden in a little alley which led from the main drive. They placed Anne in the car. Jean Leclerc got in beside her, and Espinosa took the wheel. As they took the road to the Val Terzon, a distant clock struck 11. Within the car, Jean Leclerc removed the gag from Anne Upcott's mouth, drew the sack over her, and fastened it underneath her feet. At the branch road, young Espinosa was waiting with his motorcycle and sidecar.
"I can add a few words to that story, mademoiselle," said Hanaud when she had ended. "First, Michel Levet went later into the library and bolted the window again, believing you to be well upon your way to Paris. Second, Espinosa and Jean Leclerc were taken as they returned to Madame Levet's ball."
Chapter 25. The Night of the 27th.
"We are not yet quite at the end," said Hanaud, as he sat with Frobisher for a while upon the lawn after Anne Upcott had gone in. "But we are near to it. There is still my question to be answered. Why was the communicating door open between the bedroom of Madame Hanaud and the treasure-room on the night when Anne Upcott came down the stairs in the dark? When we know that, we shall know why Francine Rollard and Betty Hanaud between them murdered Madame Hanaud."
"Then you believe Francine Rollard had a hand in that crime too?" asked Jim.
"I am sure," returned Hanaud. "Do you remember the experiment I made, the little scene of reconstruction? Betty Hanaud stretched out upon the bed to represent Madame, and Francine whispering, 'That will do now?'"
"Yes."
Hanaud lit a cigarette and smiled. "Francine Rollard would not stand at the side of the bed. No, she would stand at the foot and whisper those simple but appalling words, but nowhere else. That was significant, my friend. She would not stand exactly where she had stood when the murder was committed." He added softly, "I have great hopes of Francine Rollard, A few days of a prison cell, and that untamed little tiger-cat will talk."
"And what of Woberski in all this?" Jim exclaimed.
Hanaud laughed and rose from his chair. "Woberski? He is for nothing in all this. He brought a charge in which he didn't believe, and the charge happened to be true. That is all."
He took a step or two away and returned.
"But I'm wrong. That is not all. Woberski is indeed for something in all this. For when he was pressed to make good his charge, and must rake up some excuse for it somehow, by a piece of luck he thinks of a morning when he saw Betty Hanaud in the street of Gambetta, near to the shop of Jean Cladel. And so he leads us to the truth. Yes, we owe something to that animal, Boris Woberski. Did I not tell you, monsieur, that we are all the servants of chance?"
Hanaud went from the garden, and for 3 days Jim Frobisher saw him no more. But the development which Monsieur Bex feared, and for which Hanaud hoped, took place, and on the 3rd day Hanaud invited Jim to his office in the prefecture. He had Jim's memorandum in his hand.
"Do you remember what you wrote?" he asked. "See."
He pushed the memorandum in front of Jim and pointed to a paragraph. "But in the absence of any trace of poison in the dead woman's body, it is difficult to see how the criminal can be brought to justice except by A. a confession, B. the commission of another crime of a similar kind. Hanaud's theory, once a poisoner, always a poisoner."
Frobisher read it through. "Now that is very true," said Hanaud. "Never have I come across a case more difficult. At every step we break down. I think I have my fingers on Jean Cladel. I am 5 minutes too late. I think that I shall get some useful evidence from a firm in Paris. The firm has ceased to be for the last 10 years. All the time I strike at air. So I must take a risk, yes, and a serious one. Shall I tell you what that risk was? I have to assume that Mademoiselle Anne will be brought alive to the Hôtel de Brébizard on that night of Madame Levay's ball. That she would be brought back, I had no doubt. For one thing, there could be no safer resting place for her than under the stone flags of the kitchen there. For another, there was the portmanteau in the sidecar. It was not light, the portmanteau. Some friends of mine watched it being put into the sidecar before young Espinosa started for his rendezvous. I have no doubt it weighed just as many kilos as Mademoiselle Anne."
"I never understood the reason of that portmanteau," Frobisher interrupted.
"It was a matter of timing. There were 25 kilometers of a bad track with many sharp little twists between the Val Terzon and the Hôtel de Brébizard, and a motorcycle with an empty sidecar would take appreciably longer to cover the distance than a cycle with a sidecar weighted, which could take the corners at its top speed. They were anxious to get the exact time the journey would take with an upcut in the sidecar, so that there might be no needless hanging about waiting for its arrival. But they were a little too careful. Our friend Boris said a shrewd thing, didn't he? Some crimes are discovered because the alibis are too unnaturally perfect. Oh, there was no doubt they meant to bring back Mademoiselle Anne, but suppose they brought her back dead? It wasn't likely, no. It would be so much easier to finish her off with a dose of the arrow poison. No struggle, no blood, no trouble at all. I reckoned that they would dope her at Madame Levay's ball and bring her back half-conscious, as indeed they meant to do. But I shivered all that evening at the risk I had taken, and when that cycle shut off its engine as we stood in the darkness of the gallery, I was in despair. He shook his shoulders uncomfortably, as though the danger was not yet past. "Anyway, I took the risk," he resumed, "and so we got fulfilled your condition B, the commission, or, in this case, the attempted commission of another crime of the same kind." Frobisher nodded. "But now," said Hanaud, leaning forward, "we have got your condition A fulfilled, a confession, a clear and complete confession from Francine Rollat, and so many admissions from the Espinozas and Jean Leclerc and Maurice Thévenet that they amount to confessions. We have put them all together, and here is the new part of the case with which Monsieur Bex and you will have to deal. The charge not of murder attempted, but of murder committed. The murder of Madame Hanaud." Jim Frobisher was upon the point of interrupting, but he thought better of it. "Go on," he contented himself with saying. "Why Betty Hanaud took to writing anonymous letters, monsieur, who shall say? The dullness of life for a girl young and beautiful and passionate in a provincial town, as our friend Boris suggests, the craving for excitement, something bad and vicious and abnormal born in her, part of her, and craving more and more expression as she grew in years, the exacting attendance upon Madame. Probably all of these elements combined to suggest the notion to her, and suddenly it became easy for her. She discovered a bill in that box in Madame Hanaud's bedroom, a receipted bill 10 years old from the firm of Chaperon builders of the Rue de Batignolles in Paris. You, by the way, saw an unburnt fragment of the bill in the ashes upon the hearth of the treasure-room. This bill disclosed to her the existence of the hidden passage between the treasure-room and the Hôtel de Brebizard, for it was the bill of the builders who had repaired it at the order of Simon Hanaud. An old typewriting machine belonging to Simon Hanaud and the absolute privacy of the Hôtel de Brebizard made the game easy and safe, but as the opportunity grew, so did the desire. Betty Hanaud tasted power. She took 1 or 2 people into her confidence, her maid Francine, Maurice Thévenet, Jean Leclerc, and Jean Cladel, a very useful personage, and once started the circle grew. Blackmail followed. Blackmail of Betty Hanaud, you understand. She, the little queen, became the big slave. She must provide Thévenet with his mistress, Espinoza with his car and his house, Jean Leclerc with her luxuries. So the anonymous letters became themselves blackmailing letters. Maurice Thévenet knows the police side of Dijon and the province. Jean Leclerc has a friend, shall we say, in the director of an insurance company, and believe me, for a blackmailer nothing is more important than to know accurately the financial resources of one's, let us say, clients. Thus the game went merrily on until money was wanted and it couldn't be raised. Betty Hanaud looked around Dijon. There was no one for the moment to exploit. Yes, one person. Let us do Betty Hanaud the justice to believe that the suggestion came from that promising young novice, Maurice Thévenet. Who was that person, Monsieur Frobisher? Even now Jim Frobisher was unable to guess the truth, led up to it though he had been by Hanaud's exposition. "Why, Madame Hanaud herself," Hanaud explained, and as Jim Frobisher started back in a horror of disbelief, he continued, "Yes, it is so. Madame Hanaud received a letter at dinner-time just as Anne Upcott did on the night of Monsieur de Pouyac's ball. She took her dinner in bed, you may remember that night. That letter was shown to Jean Baudin, the nurse, who remembers it very well. It demanded a large sum of money, and something was said about a number of passionate letters which Madame Hanaud might not care to have published. Not too much, you understand, but enough to make it clear that the liaison of Madame Raviat and Simon Hanaud was not a secret from the scourge. I'll tell you something else which will astonish you, Monsieur Frobisher. That letter was shown not only to Jean Baudin, but to Betty Hanaud herself, when she came to say good night and show herself in her new dance frock of silver tissue and her silver slippers. It was no wonder that Betty Hanaud lost her head a little when I set my little trap for her in the library and pretended that I did not want to read what Madame had said to Jean Baudin after Betty Hanaud had gone off to her ball. I hadn't one idea what a very unpleasant little trap it was. But wait a moment, Frobisher interrupted. If Madame Hanaud showed this letter first of all to Jean Baudin, and afterwards to Betty Hanaud in Jean Baudin's presence, why didn't Jean Baudin speak of it at once to the examining magistrate when Woberski brought his accusation? She kept silent. Yes, she kept silent. Why shouldn't she? Returned Hanaud. Jean Baudin is a good and decent girl. For her, Madame Hanaud had died a natural death in her sleep, the very form in which death might be expected to come for her. Jean Baudin didn't believe a word of Woberski's accusation. Why should she rake up old scandals? She herself proposed to Betty Hanaud to say nothing about the anonymous letter. Jim Frobisher thought over the argument and accepted it. "Yes, I see her point of view," he admitted, and Hanaud continued his narrative. "Well, then, Betty Hanaud is off to her ball on the Boulevard Thiers. Anne Upcott is in her sitting-room. Jean Baudin has finished her offices for the night. Madame Hanaud is alone. What does she do? Drink? For that night, no. She sits and thinks. Were there any of the letters which passed between her and Simon Hanaud before she was Simon Hanaud's wife still existing? She had thought to have destroyed them all, but she was a woman. She might have clutched some back. If there were any, where would they be? Why, in that house at the end of the secret passage. Some such thoughts must have passed through her mind, for she rose from her bed, slipped on her dressing-gown and shoes, unlocked the communicating door between her and the treasure-room, and passed by the secret way into the empty Hôtel de Brébizard. And what does she find there, monsieur? A room in daily use, a bundle of her letters ready in the top drawer of her Empire writing-table, and on the writing-table Simon's Corona machine, and the paper and envelopes of the anonymous letters. Monsieur, there is only one person who can have access to that room, the girl whom she has befriended, whom in her exacting way she no doubt loved. And at 11 o'clock that night, Francine Rollard is startled by the entrance of Madame Hanaud into her bedroom. For a moment, Francine fancied that Madame had been drinking. She was very quickly better informed. She was told to get up, to watch for Betty Hanaud's return, and to bring her immediately to Madame Hanaud's bedroom. At 1 o'clock, Francine Rollard is waiting in the dark hall. As Betty comes in from her party, Francine Rollard gives her the message. Neither of these two girls knows as yet how much of their villainies has been discovered, but something at all events. Betty Hanaud bade Francine wait, and ran upstairs silently to her room. Betty Hanaud was prepared against discovery. She had been playing with fire, and she didn't mean to be burnt. She had the arrow poison ready, yes, ready for herself. She filled her hypodermic needle, and with that concealed in the palm of her glove, she went to confront her benefactress. You can imagine that scene, the outraged woman whose romance and tragedy were to be exploited, blurting out her fury in front of Francine Rollard. It wasn't Wabersky who was to be stripped to the skin. No, but the girl in the pretty silver frock and the silver slippers. You can imagine the girl, too, her purpose changing under the torrent of abuse. Why should she use the arrow poison to destroy herself when she can save everything, fortune, liberty, position, by murder? Only she must be quick. Madame's voice is rising in gusts of violence. Even in that house of the old thick walls, Jean Baudin, someone, might be wakened by the clamour, and in a moment the brutal thing is done. Madame Hanaud is flung back upon her bed. Her mouth is covered and held by Francine Rollard. The needle does its work. "That will do now," whispers Betty Hanaud. But at the door of the treasure-room, in the darkness, Anne Upcott is standing, unable to identify the voice which whispered, just as you and I were unable, monsieur, to identify a voice which whispered to us from the window of Jean Claudel's house, but taking deep into her memory the terrible words, and neither of the murderesses knew it. They go calmly about their search for the letters. They cannot find them, because Madame had pushed them into the coffer of old bills and papers. They rearrange the bed, they compose their victim in it as if she were asleep, they pass into the treasure-room, and they forget to lock the door behind them. Very likely they visit the Hôtel de Brebizard. Betty Hanaud has the rest of the arrow poison and the needle to put in some safe place, and where else is safe? In the end, when every care has been taken that not a scrap of incriminating evidence is left to shout murder the next morning, Betty creeps up the stairs to make sure that Anne Upcott is asleep, and Anne Upcott, waking, stretches up her hands and touches her face. "That, monsieur," and Hanaud rose to his feet, "is what you would call the case for the Crown. It is the case which you and Monsieur Bex have to meet." Jim Frobisher made up his mind to say the things which he had almost said at the beginning of this interview. "I shall tell Monsieur Bex exactly what you have told me. I shall give him every assistance that I, personally, or my firm can give. But I have no longer any formal connection with the defence." Hanaud looked at Frobisher in perplexity. "I don't understand, monsieur. This is not the moment to renounce a client." "Nor do I," rejoined Frobisher. "It is the other way about. Monsieur Bex put it to me very, how shall I say—" Hanaud supplied the missing word with a twitch of his lips. "Very correctly." "He told me that mademoiselle did not wish to see me again." Hanaud walked over to the window. The humiliation evident in Frobisher's voice and face moved him. He said very gently, "I can understand that, can't you? She has fought for a great stake all this last week, her liberty, her fortune, her good name. And you, oh yes," he continued as Jim stirred at the table, "let us be frank. And you, monsieur, you were a little different from her friends. From the earliest moment she set her passions upon you. Do you remember the first morning I came to the Maison Grenelle? You promised Anne Upcott to put up there, though you had just refused the same invitation from Betty Hanaud. Such a fury of jealousy blazed in her eyes that I had to drop my stick with a clatter in the hall, lest she should recognize that I could not but have discovered her secret. Well, having fought for this stake and lost, she would not wish to see you. You had seen her, too, in her handcuffs, and tied by the legs like a sheep. I understand her very well." Jim Frobisher remembered that from the moment Hanaud burst into the room at the Hôtel de Brébizard, Betty had never once even looked at him. He got up from his chair and took up his hat and stick. "I must go back to my partner in London with this story as soon as I have told it to Monsieur Bex," he said. "I should like it complete. When did you first suspect Betty Harlow?" Hanaud nodded. "That, too, I shall tell you. Oh, don't thank me. I am not so sure that I should be so ready with all these confidences if I was not certain what the verdict in the assize court must be. I shall gather up for you the threads which are still loose, but not here." He looked at his watch. "See, it is past noon. We shall once more have Philippe Le Bon's terrace tower to ourselves. It may be, too, that we shall see Mont Blanc across all the leagues of France. Come, let us take your memorandum and go there." Chapter 26. The Façade of Notre Dame. For a second time they were fortunate. It was a day without mist or clouds, and the towering silver ridge hung in the blue sky distinct and magical. Hanaud lit one of his black cigarettes, and reluctantly turned away from it. "There were two great mistakes made," he said. "One at the very beginning by Betty Harlow, one at the very end by me, and of the two mine was the least excusable. Let us begin, therefore, at the beginning. Madame Harlow has died a natural death. She is buried. Betty Harlow inherits the Harlow fortune. Boris Wabersky asks her for money, and she snaps her the fingers. Why should she not? Ah, but she must have been very sorry a week later that she snapped her the fingers, for suddenly he flings his bomb. Madame Harlow was poisoned by her niece Betty. Imagine Betty Harlow's feelings when she heard of that. The charge is preposterous, no doubt, but it is also true. A minute back she is safe. Nothing can touch her. Now suddenly her head is loose upon her neck. She is frightened. She is questioned in the examining magistrate's room. The magistrate has nothing against her. All will be well if she does not make a slip. But there is a good chance she may make a slip, for she has done the murder. Her danger is not any evidence which Wabersky can bring, but just herself. In 2 days she is still more frightened, for she hears that Hanaud is called in from Paris, so she makes her mistake. She sends a telegram to you in London." "Why was that a mistake?" Frobisher asked quickly. "Because I begin to ask myself at once, how does Betty Harlow know that Hanaud has been called in? Oh, to be sure, I made a great fluster in my office about the treachery of my colleagues in Dijon, but I did not believe a word of that. No, I am at once curious about Betty Harlow. That is all. Still, I am curious. Well, we come to Dijon, and you tell her that you have shown me that telegram." "Yes," Jim admitted. "I did. I remember, too," he added slowly, "that she put out her hand on the window-sill. Yes, as if to steady herself." "But she was quick to recover," returned Hanaud with a nod of appreciation. "She must account for that telegram. She cannot tell me that Maurice Thévenet sent a hurried word to her. No. So when I ask her if she has ever received one of these anonymous letters, which, remember, were my real business in Dijon, she says at once, "Yes, I received one on the Sunday morning which told me that Monsieur Hanaud was coming from Paris to make an end of me." That was quick, eh? Yes, but I know it is a lie, for it was not until the Sunday evening that any question of my being sent for arose at all. You see, Mademoiselle Betty was in a corner. I had asked her for the letter. She does not say that she has destroyed it, lest I should at once believe that she never received any such letter at all. On the contrary, she says that it is in the treasure-room, which is sealed up, knowing quite well that she can write it and place it there by way of the Hôtel de Brebizard before the seals are removed. But for the letter to be in the treasure-room, she must have received it on the Sunday morning, since it was on the Sunday morning that the seals were affixed. She did not know when it was first proposed to call me in. She draws a bow at a venture, and I know that she is lying, and I am more curious than ever about Betty Hallowes." He stopped, for Jim Frobisher was staring at him with a look of horror in his eyes. "It was I, then, who put you on her track? I who came out to defend her," he cried, "for it was I who showed you the telegram." "Monsieur Frobisher, that would not have mattered if Betty Hallowes had been, as you believed her, innocent," Hanaud replied gravely, and Frobisher was silent. "Well, then, after my first interview with Betty Hallowes, I went over the house whilst you and Betty talked together in the library." "Yes," said Jim. "And in Mademoiselle Anne's sitting-room I found something which interested me at the first glance. Now tell me what it was." And he cocked his head at Jim with the hope that his riddle would divert him from his self-reproaches, and in that, to some extent, he succeeded. "That I can guess," Frobisher answered, with the ghost of a smile. "It was the treatise on Strophanthus." "Yes, the arrow poison, the poison which leaves no trace. Monsieur, that poison has been my nightmare. Who would be the first poisoner to use it? How should I cope with him and prove that it brought no more security than arsenic or prussic acid? These are questions which have terrified me, and suddenly, unexpectedly, in a house where a death from heart failure has just occurred, I find a dry-as-dust treatise upon the poison tucked away under a pile of magazines in a young lady's sitting-room. I tell you I was staggered. What was it doing there? How did it come there? I see a note upon the cover indicating a page. I turn to the page, and there, staring at me, is an account of Simon Harlowe's perfect specimen of a poison arrow. The anonymous letters, they are at once forgotten. What if that animal were Bursky, without knowing it, were right, and Madame Hanaud was murdered in the Maison Grenelle? I must find that out. I tuck the treatise up my back beneath my waistcoat, and I go downstairs again, asking myself some questions. Is Mademoiselle Anne interested in such matters as Strophanthus hispidus? Or had she anything to hope for from Madame Hallow's death? Or did she perhaps not know at all that the treatise was under that pile of magazines upon the table at the side? I do not know, and my head is rather in a whirl. Then I catch that wicked look of Betty Hallowes at her friend. Monsieur, a revealing look. I have not the demure and simple young lady of convention to deal with at all. No, I go away from the Maison Grenelle still more curious about Betty Hallowes. Jim Frobisher sat quickly down at Hanaud's side. "Are you sure of that?" he asked suspiciously. "Quite," Hanaud replied in wonder.
You have forgotten, haven't you, that immediately after you left the Maison Grenelle that day, you had the Sergeant de Ville removed from its gates?"
"No, I don't forget that at all," Hanaud answered imperturbably. "The Sergeant de Ville in his white trousers was an absurdity. Worse than that, an actual hindrance. There is little use in watching people who know that they are being watched. So I removed the Sergeant de Ville, and now I can begin really to watch those young ladies of the Maison Grenelle. And that afternoon, whilst Monsieur Frobisher is removing his luggage from his hotel, Betty Hallot goes out for a walk, is discreetly followed by Nicolas Moreau, and vanishes. I don't blame Nicolas. He must not press too close upon her heels. She was in that place of small lanes about the Hôtel de Brébizat. No doubt it was through the little postern in the wall which we ourselves used a few days afterwards that she vanished. There was the anonymous letter to be written, ready for me to receive when the seals of the treasure-room were broken. But I don't know that yet. No, all that I know is that Betty Hallot goes out for a walk and is lost, and after an hour reappears in another street. Meanwhile, I pass my afternoon examining, so far as I can, how these young ladies pass their lives and who are their friends. An examination not very productive and not altogether futile, for I find some curious friends in Betty Hallot's circle. Now, observe this, monsieur. Young girls with advanced ideas, social, political, literary, what you will. In their case, curious friends mean nothing. They are to be expected. But with a young girl who is to all appearance leading the normal life of her class, the case is different. In her case, curious friends are curious. The Espinozas, Maurice Thévenet, Jean Leclerc, flashy, cheap people of that type, how shall we account for them as friends of that delicate piece of china, Betty Hallot? Jim Frobisher nodded his head. He, too, had been a trifle disconcerted by the familiarity between Espinoza and Betty Hallot. "The evening," Hanaud continued, "which you spent so pleasantly in the cool of the garden with the young ladies, I spent with the Edinburgh professor, and I prepared a little trap. Yes, and the next morning I came early to the Maison Grenelle, and I set my little trap. I replaced the book about the arrows on the bookshelf in its obvious place." Hanaud paused in his explanation to take another black cigarette from his eternal blue bundle and to offer one to Jim. "Then comes our interview with the animal Wabersky, and he tells me that queer story about Betty Hallot in the street of Gambetta close to the shop of Jean Cladel. He may be lying, he may be speaking the truth, and what he saw might be an accident. Yes, but also it fits in with this theory of Madame Hallot's murder which is now taking hold of me. For if that poison was used, then someone who understood the composition of drugs must have made the solution from the paste upon the arrow. I am more curious than ever about Betty Hallot, and the moment that animal has left me, I spring my trap, and I have a success beyond all my expectations. I point to the treatise of the Edinburgh professor. It was not in its place yesterday. It is today. Who then replaced it? I ask that question, and Mademoiselle Anne is utterly at sea. She knows nothing about that book. That is evident as Mont Blanc over there in the sky. On the other hand, Betty Hallot knows at once who has replaced that book, and in a most unwise moment of sarcasm she allows me to see that she knows. She knows that I found it yesterday, that I have studied it since and replaced it, and she is not surprised. No, for she knows where I found it. I am at once like Wabersky. I know it in my heart that she put it under those magazines in Anne Upcott's room, although I do not yet know it in my head. Betty Harlow had prepared to divert suspicion from herself upon Anne Upcott, should suspicion arise. But innocent people do not do that, monsieur. Then we go into the garden, and Mademoiselle Anne tells us her story. Monsieur Frobisher, I said to you immediately afterwards that all great criminals who are women are great actresses, but never in my life have I seen one who acted so superbly as Betty Harlow while that story was being unfolded. Imagine it. A cruel murder has been secretly committed, and suddenly the murderess has to listen to a true account of that murder in the presence of the detective who is there to fix the guilt. There was someone at hand all the time, almost an eyewitness, perhaps an actual eyewitness, for she cannot know that she is safe until the last word of the story is told. Picture to yourself Betty Harlow's feelings during that hour in the pleasant garden, if you can. The questions which must have been racing through her mind. Did Anne Upcott in the end creep forward and peer through the lighted doorway? Does she know the truth, and has she kept it hidden until this moment, when Hanaud and Frobisher are present, and she can speak it safely? Will her next words be, "And here at my side sits the murderess"? Those must have been terrible moments for Betty Harlow. "Yet she gave no sign of any distress," Frobisher added. "But she took a precaution," Hanaud remarked. "She ran suddenly and very swiftly into the house." "Yes, you seemed to me on the point of stopping her." "And I was," continued Hanaud, "but I let her go, and she returned—" "With the photographs of Mrs. Harlow," Frobisher interrupted. "Oh, with more than those photographs," Hanaud exclaimed. "She turned her chair towards Mademoiselle Anne. She sat with her handkerchief in her hand and her face against her handkerchief, listening, the tender, sympathetic friend. But when Mademoiselle Anne told us that the hour of the murder was 10:30, a weakness overtook her, could not but overtake her, and in that moment of weakness she dropped her handkerchief. Oh, she picked it up again at once. Yes, but where the handkerchief had fallen, her foot now rested, and when the story was all ended, and we got up from our chairs, she spun round upon her heel with a certain violence, so that there was left a hole in that well-watered turf. I was anxious to discover what it was that she had brought out from the house in her handkerchief, and had dropped with her handkerchief, and had driven with all the weight of her body into the turf, so that no one might see it. In fact, I left my gloves behind in order that I might come back and discover it. But she was too quick for me. She fetched my gloves herself, much to my shame that I, Hanaud, should be waited on by so exquisite a young lady. However, I found it afterwards, when you and Girardot and the others were all waiting for me in the library. It was that tablet of cyanide of potassium which I showed to you in the prefecture. She did not know how much Anne Upcott was going to reveal. The arrow poison had been hidden away in the Hôtel de Brébizat, but she had something else at hand, more rapid, death like a thunderbolt. So she ran into the house for it. I tell you, monsieur, it wanted nerve to sit there with that tablet close to her mouth. She grew very pale. I do not wonder. What I do wonder is that she did not topple straight off her chair in a dead faint before us all. But no, she sat ready to swallow that tablet at once if there were need, before my hand could stop her. Once more I say to you, people who are innocent do not do that." Jim had no argument wherewith to answer. Yes, he was forced to admit, she could have got the tablets, no doubt, from Jean Cladel. "Very well, then," Hanaud resumed. "We have separated for luncheon, and in the afternoon the seals are to be removed. Before that takes place, certain things must be done. The clock must be moved from the mantel-shelf in the treasure-room on to the marquetry cabinet. Some letters, too, must be burnt." "Yes, why?" Frobisher asked eagerly. Hanaud shrugged his shoulders. "The letters were burned. It is difficult to say. For my part, I think those old letters between Simon Harlow and Madame Ravillard alluded too often to the secret passage. But here I am guessing. What I learnt for certain during that luncheon hour is that there is a secret passage, and that it runs from the treasure-room to the Hôtel de Brebizard. For this time Nicolas Moreau makes no mistake. He follows her to the Hôtel de Brebizard, and I from this tower see the smoke rising from the chimney. Look, monsieur, there it is, but no smoke rises from it today." He rose to his feet and turned his back upon Mont Blanc. The trees in the garden, the steep yellow-patterned roof, and the chimneys of the Maison Grenelle stood out above the lesser buildings which surrounded them. Only from one of the chimneys did the smoke rise today, and that one at the extreme end of the building where the kitchens were. "We are back, then, in the afternoon. The seals are removed. We are in Madame Harlow's bedroom, and something I cannot explain occurs." "The disappearance of the necklace!" Frobisher exclaimed confidently, and Hanaud grinned joyfully. "See, I set a trap for you, and at once you are caught," he cried. "The necklace? Oh, no, I am prepared for that. The guilt is being transferred to Mademoiselle Anne. Good. But it is not enough to hide the book about the arrow in her room. No, we must provide her also with a motive. Mademoiselle is poor. Mademoiselle inherits nothing. Therefore, the necklace worth £100,000 vanishes, and you must draw from its vanishing what conclusion you will. No, the little matter I cannot explain is different. Betty Harlow and our good Girardot pay a visit to Jean Baudin's bedroom to make sure that a cry from Madame's room could not be heard there." "Yes." "Our good Girardot comes back." "Yes." "But he comes alone. That is a little thing I cannot explain. Where is Betty Harlow? I ask for her before I go into the treasure-room, and lo, very modestly and quietly she has slipped in amongst us again. I am very curious about that, my friend, and I keep my eyes open for an explanation, I assure you." "I remember," said Frobisher. "You stopped with your hand upon the door and asked for Mademoiselle Harlow. I wondered why you stopped. I attached no importance to her absence." Hanaud flourished his hand. He was happy. He was in the artist's mood. The work was over, the long strain and pain of it. Now let those outside admire. "Of all that the treasure-room had to tell us, you know, Monsieur Frobisher. But I answer a question in your memorandum. The instant I am in the room, I look for the mouth of that secret passage from the Hôtel de Brebizard. At once I see there is only one place, the elegant sedan chair framed so prettily in a recess of the wall. So I am very careful not to pry amongst its cushions for the poison arrow, just as I am very careful not to ask for the envelope with the postmark in which the anonymous letter was sent. If Betty Harlow thinks that she has overreached the old fox Hanaud, good. Let her think so. So we go upstairs, and I find the explanation of that little matter of Betty Harlow's absence which has been so troubling me."
Jim Frobisher stared at him. "No," he said, "I haven't got that. We went into Anne Upcott's sitting-room. I write my memorandum with the shaft of the poison arrow, and you notice it. Yes, but the matter of Betty Harlow's absence, no, I haven't got that."
"But you have!" cried Hanaud. "That pen! It was not there in the pen tray on the day before when I found the book. There was just one pen, the foolish thing young ladies use, a great goose quill dyed red, and nothing else. The arrow shaft had been placed there since. When? Why, just now. It is clear that. Where was that shaft of the poison arrow before? In one of two places, either in the treasure-room or in the Hôtel de Brebizard. Betty Harlow has fetched it away during that hour of freedom. She carries it in her dress. She seizes her moment when we are all in Madame Harlow's bedroom, and pam, there it is in the pen tray of Mademoiselle Anne, to make suspicion still more convincing. Monsieur, I walk away with Monsieur Bex, who has some admirable scheme that I should search the gutters for a matchbox full of pearls. I agree. Oh, yes, that is the only way. Monsieur Bex has found it. On the other hand, I get some useful information about the Maison Grenelle and the Hôtel de Brebizard. I carry that information to a very erudite gentleman in the palace of the departmental archives, and the next morning I know all about the severe Etienne de Grenelle and the joyous Madame de Brebizard. So, when you and Betty Harlow are rehearsing in the Val Terzon, Nicolas Moreau and I are very busy in the Hôtel de Brebizard, with the results which now are clear to you, and one of which I have not told you, for the pearl necklace was in the drawer of the writing-table.
Jim Frobisher took a turn across the terrace. Yes, the story was clear to him now, a story of dark passions and vanity and greed of power with cruelties for its methods. Was there no spark of hope and cheer in all this desolation? He turned abruptly upon Hanaud. He wished to know the last hidden detail. "You said that you had made the inexcusable mistake. What was it?"
"I bade you read my estimate of Anne Upcott on the façade of the Church of Notre Dame."
"And I did," cried Jim Frobisher. He was still looking towards the Maison Grenelle, and his arms swept to the left of the house. His fingers pointed at the Renaissance church with its cupolas and its loggia, to which Betty Harlow had driven him. "There it is, and under its porch is that terrible relief of the Last Judgment."
"Yes," said Hanaud quietly, "but that is the Church of Saint-Michel, monsieur."
He turned Frobisher about. Between him and Mont Blanc, close at his feet, rose the slender apse of a Gothic church, delicate in its structure like a jewel.
"That is the Church of Notre Dame. Let us go down and look at the façade."
Hanaud led Frobisher to the wonderful church and pointed to the frieze. There Frobisher saw such images of devils, half beast, half human, such grinning hog-men, such tortured creatures with heads twisted round so that they looked backwards, such old and drunken and vicious horrors as imagination could hardly conceive, and amongst them one girl praying, her sweet face tormented, her hands tightly clasped, an image of terror and faith, a prisoner amongst all these monsters, imploring the passers-by for their pity and their help.
"That, Monsieur Frobisher, is what I sent you out to see," said Hanaud gravely. "But you did not see it."
His face changed as he spoke. It shone with kindness. He lifted his hat. Jim Frobisher, with his eyes fixed in wonder upon that frieze,
heard Anne Upcott's voice behind him. "And how do you interpret that strange work, Monsieur Hanaud?" She stopped beside the two men. "That, mademoiselle, I shall leave Monsieur Frobisher to explain to you." Both Anne Upcott and Jim Frobisher turned hurriedly towards Hanaud, but already he was gone. The end. This concludes our reading of The House of the Arrow by A.E.W. Mason, narrated by Graham Scott. The text used for this recording was published in 1924 and is in the public domain. Production copyright 2023 for this unabridged recording is held by Voices of Today. Neither this recording nor any portion of it may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authorization from Blackstone Publishing. Thank you for listening.
Audible hopes you